The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, we're going to talk about successful utility scale solar development. My guest today is Robert Howard with Greenleaf Advisors based in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome to the Solar Podcast, Robert.
Thanks, Tim. Excited to be here.
You know, we have had several developers on the podcast, but we've never really focused or shined a light on what do young developers need to know to be successful in this industry. So we're going to really shine a light on that today, and I'm excited to have you on the show. You do a lot of work with one of our dear partners, and that's Intelligent Generation, also based in Chicago. That is a software as a service company for the battery storage and solar industry. But tell our audience, how did you get interested in solar and a little bit about your background as a developer?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I started my career actually in management consulting at KPMG, right at the depths of the Great Recession. And a lot of companies were looking for opportunities to improve. And it was really kind of this test bed for, sustainability as a real profit driver for a lot of companies. So interesting period to be in that space. And did some interesting projects on the sustainability side for Southern California Edison, one of the largest investor-owned utilities in the country, and also BP in Chicago. And BP project was very interesting, but that was actually right around the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and caught the sustainability bug and clean energy bug that way. And from that point, it's really been mostly clean energy for me all the way. Did a stint at a venture capital funded energy storage startup called General Compression in Boston. Really interesting technology that stored renewable energy in the form of compressed air underground and released it when it was more valuable. From there, spent some time still in Boston at a independent power producer called Intergen, and they were actually in the 90s, one of the real trailblazers for the IPP model, and that's independent power producer, where in deregulated markets around the world, owning generating assets separate from the local utility and operating them, more efficiently than a lot of these utilities would. And it was a joint venture between Bechtel, a really large international engineering, procurement, and construction firm, and Shell, the oil and gas super major. They came together, formed this company, and it was off from there. And there I did a lot of development work, greenfield development work in Mexico, and also some M&A, acquisition activity, buying and selling power generation assets, wind, natural gas, mostly. One of the more interesting projects I did there was I was on the team that did the first cross-border wind project in Baja, Mexico. It was called Energía Sierra Juarez, 144 megawatt wind project that wheeled power over the border from Mexico to San Diego Gas and Electric. Obviously, permitting was a nightmare for that, but it was a really interesting project, and I was glad to be involved with that. But most recently, my job before my current role at Greenleaf was at Invenergy, which is the largest independent renewable energy provider in North America. They've developed about, I think, over 30,000 megawatts now of power projects in North America, some in Europe, some in Japan. But the company was started by a man named Michael Polsky. He actually, Tim, I don't know if you saw, he had a profile in Forbes the other week. It's pretty interesting. But he has interesting background himself, started this company in the early 2000s, kind of on the backs of, wind as a growth platform. It was pretty innovative at the time. But since then, the company has just grown rapidly, and they're one of the biggest players in renewable energy production in the world, definitely. And besides NextEra, which is publicly traded, it's my understanding they have the most capacity under management. So since then, moved over to Greenleaf in 2019. And as you mentioned, Tim, worked closely with one of our good friends' companies at Intelligent Generation. And Greenleaf is a transaction advisory services firm, work with sustainable companies in land, water, materials, and energy. And I lead up the energy side, working with companies like IG on strategic initiatives, raising outside capital, helping them with new project development, things of that nature. And at the end of the day, we're just interested in working with companies that are aligned with Greenleaf's mission of mitigating climate change and saving the planet.
Excellent. Well, Invenergy is well known here in Illinois as a wind developer, and now they're doing several large scale solar developments. They were in the news. We reported on this on the Clean Power Hour last week with a 1.3 gigawatt project in Texas. So they really do know how to do large scale wind and solar. And so it's great to have you in our midst. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your knowledge and experience with our audience. Let's get into it. A, B, C, D, alpha to omega. What does solar development entail? How do you even conceptualize a project? Because let's face it, we are rich in land, right? Just look at Illinois. We have so much land resources. And so it's almost dizzying and difficult to identify, well, where is the need? And so how do developers decide, okay, this is where we're going to shine a light? Obviously, solar is a very geographic based industry. Some markets are hot, some are not. Illinois is booming and busting for community solar. I'm not sure about utility scale solar. We are getting a utility scale market here. About 600 megawatts of utility scale solar at least are under development in Illinois. But that's peanuts compared to a market like Texas, which has multiple gigawatts of solar in their queue. So how do you identify locations and then zoom in on specific projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, this topic is becoming ever more important for the same reasons why you are seeing that project you mentioned in Texas, Tim, Samson Solar. That's been in the works for a long time. I actually worked closely with one of the developers at Invenergy who was working on that a few years ago. But the story everyone knows about is costs keep coming down. These projects are going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, moving further and further north into areas where there might not be as much sunshine. And you're right. I mean, you look all around, land visibly doesn't seem like a constraint. There's lots of land everywhere in the upper Midwest, lots of agricultural communities that have lots of good stuff they can do with their land. But when identifying a new solar site, I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who's him and a few colleagues are starting to dabble in community solar in North Carolina. And, they came to me with some property listings and said, hey, what would you think if we did solar here? And, my initial reaction is to anyone doing solar is start with the electrical interconnection first. That's first and foremost where you got to go. That's one of the largest constraints in North America for sure on integrating new renewables, is finding that spot on the grid where there's enough capacity to inject energy from a renewable project like a solar project. And so, when developing a new project, we would always start with the physical wires, looking at maps. ArcGIS has some good resources, really identifying areas physically away from large population centers that still have pretty good transmission infrastructure, substations, high voltage transmission, things like that. And just identifying spots, just some satellite images that look okay that they might be a good fit for a solar project based on those factors. But then there's an element of drilling down. Take a look at the queue if you're in MISO, for instance, which is partially Illinois up through Minnesota down to Louisiana. Go online. All these regional transmission organizations such as MISO have their queues up there with substation names. Occasionally have more information like capacity of the project, things like that. Just take a look and see who's sniffing around any areas that you'd identified as a utility scale project, just to understand what the competitive landscape is. And that's really the first step, I think, to work in developing these projects. Just understanding at the highest level, can they fit on the grid, and if they can they fit physically in the area you're looking at?
I'm glad you mentioned MISO. MISO is a very large ISO. That's an independent system operator. The United States and North America is broken into these large regions. They're multi-state regions. MISO includes part of Canada down to you mentioned Louisiana. It's a huge swath of the middle part of the country. Not all of Illinois. A big part of central and southern Illinois is in MISO. Northern Illinois, oddly enough, is in PJM. That's a relic of when the grid was first getting started, I think. And but these ISOs, they themselves are going through an evolution. And MISO, my impression is from a distance, is that MISO is kind of now becoming a more attractive asset, so to speak, for developers. There's 60 plus gigawatts of projects in the MISO queue, and it's somewhat of a greenfield compared to the coasts, right? Solar has come first to the Mid-Atlantic region and the New York, Massachusetts, the New Jersey, the Carolinas, and then of course to the West Coast with California and Hawaii, and the Southwest with Colorado and Arizona and Utah. So here we are. We're a little bit of a latecomer. I like to say we're 10 years behind the coasts. That's not a slam in any way. It just is what it is. We have very cheap power here in the Midwest, tons of cheap coal. That is now getting retired en masse because these facilities are uneconomical. Natural gas is beating coal into the ground. And now wind and solar are the cheapest new sources of energy available. The other thing that's going on is we are going to triple the grid. Okay, we need a lot more energy when we go through this energy transition and electrify transportation. And most consumers have no idea about this. But what that means is we're going to also rebuild the physical grid infrastructure, right? It needs to be upgraded and modernized. And there's a long, long way to go. Which is just an economic opportunity. Again, it's not a slam. It is what it is. And the grid is a very old and complicated machine. Some people say it's the most complicated machine that humans ever invented. It's a miracle sometimes that it even works. And here we are completely dependent on electricity, right? Our modern civilization is built on the foundation of having electricity for everything. Without electricity, 3/4 of people on Earth starve to death and are gone within 2 years. That's how dependent we are on electricity. We are no longer a hunter-gatherer, survivalist species. We are a live-in heated spaces with lights and internet. And when that goes away, it's lights out for us. So let's talk a little bit about how do you even follow that landscape of the ISOs? Is there a methodology to that?
Well, I think part of it is just what you described. Where's the competition at? What are the next hot markets? And just touching on MISO again for a moment, you hit it spot on. I mean, it started mostly on the coast, and solar is getting more heavily in the Midwest. And I think that was driven by several factors. Partially is just the fact that in the Midwest, we have great wind resource here. I mean, Iowa, southern Minnesota, Illinois, those are some of the hotbeds of wind development and have been for a long time. And so if we were behind the 8 ball a little bit, I think it was partially because there was such a good wind resource. But, solar gets cheaper and cheaper. Eventually, solar's beating wind in a lot of these cases, in a lot of these markets. So I think, part of it is just understanding where the trends are. You don't want to be in an area where you don't want to be last to the party. You want to be first. And, getting into the development cycle early on and being able to be in a position to strike when economic and market forces are available for these projects is really important. But there are a lot of hurdles. You mentioned over 60 gigawatts of solar in MISO, and how is that going to affect an older grid design? And it's a problem, and everyone's trying to figure out solutions to do it. One of the projects my manager at Invenergy was working on before I started there was a wind project in South Dakota, which is in MISO. And it, during the interconnection process, actually tripped off an upgrade requirement in Michigan. So these grid systems are so complicated and so large because of the way the energy was going to flow in that system. There was going to have to be a transmission system upgrade all the way in Michigan to support this wind project in South Dakota. So that just gives you a sense of how complex these projects are, and a key to understanding where you want to be in these, whether it's choosing an RTO or picking an area to be in an RTO, is trying to avoid situations like that. And there's people a lot smarter than me that specialize and give you that information. Another thing to consider certainly is just culture around renewables. Tim, we live not too far from each other, so I'm sure you've driven through Indiana. But Indiana, northwest part of the state, huge wind farms. They love renewables up there. And they've built a lot of wind. I think one of the largest wind farms in the country is it might be EDPR, but it's in Northwest Indiana. You drive down the interstate there, 65, I believe, and it's wind as far as the eye can see, but you go into other places and it's just, you get run out of town if you're trying to develop a renewables project. So, there's certain places in Ohio that are like that, which, you might have great wind resource or solar resource, but the community just doesn't want to have you there. So just understanding the community appetite for these projects is really important, in addition to just the cold economics of it.
And I'm sharing my screen now with a map of MISO, just so our listeners and viewers can see what that looks like. And I'm glad you mentioned that project in Indiana. I don't know the name of that wind farm, but when I first drove through that, I had my mind completely blown, because it was wind turbines as far as the eye can see. We have some large wind farms, of course, here in central Illinois, but nothing like that one in western Indiana. So solar is a team sport. You need to find a very competent team of people that are very collaborative, right? You mentioned expertise. Developers tend to be people that have multiple skill sets. They need to be good at communication. They need to be analytical, perhaps have an engineering background, but in any case, they're bringing multiple skill sets together, but then they're going to lean on a team of electrical engineers and perhaps other business development professionals. So there's no simple answer to what the composition of the team is, but it when you meet a successful team, because they're getting projects across the finish line. And I feel like we're really at the beginning of this S curve, right? We're staged to install perhaps 800 gigawatts of solar in the next 15 years in the United States. So we're still down here. We're just about to take off. We're going to go vertical. And then in 15, 20 years, it's going to asymptote. But there's a huge growth opportunity, and that means tons of jobs and tons of opportunity for professionals at all stages of career. If you're a college student, a young professional, mid-career, the world is your oyster when it comes to renewable energy. So please dive in, educate yourself, get involved with your state organization first and foremost. That's how I got into the solar industry, through ICEA here in Illinois, the Illinois Solar Energy Association, and every state has a renewables organization or multiple. Now, let's go a little deeper into, okay, let's say that you know a specific region, say ERCOT in Texas, just to name another ISO, right? ERCOT is a big swath of Texas. I'll bring up a map here in a little bit, but and I know that a lot of developers are working on projects in ERCOT, and so now you have a geography. You mentioned identifying the infrastructure. Where is their capacity on the grid? Because a generating facility at the end of the day, right, is going to inject power, especially with solar, on a time-based basis, right? When the sun is shining, it's cranking, and the grid has to have the capacity, the availability to absorb that energy and then distribute it somewhere else where the energy is used, the population centers, namely.
Mhm.
And you need things like substations. Here in my backyard, 10 miles from my home, we have a 150 megawatt project being developed called Prairie Solar by Baywa Re. They cited that project specifically because of a very large substation that is in that just outside of the town of Sydney, Illinois. And there's only two of those substations of that capacity in the whole county of Champaign County, which is a large county. It's 640,000 acres. Um, so let's say you've identified some assets, so to speak, in terms of grid capacity, and you've identified some nodes where you can get power onto the transmission grid. What's next?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, just by the nature of the business, long development cycles, a lot of development work is speculative to some extent, and the reality is, at the end of the day, you do need an off-taker, some sort of credit-worthy customer that's going to be able to purchase the energy long term, and that's something that's required to get it financed. So the assumption today, which has proved out correct so far, is you find a good spot on the grid, you build a cheap clean energy project. The world is transitioning so quickly to renewables and clean energy. It's very likely in between now and when you need to break ground on the project, you could find some sort of offtake agreement. But still, you want to obviously limit your risk on that, because it might happen that you won't. But for next steps, Tim, I mean, to the extent you can actually get commercial interest in a project, sometime that's impossible to do so early on. But absolutely, getting some sort of commercial indication, if you have those relationships, to understand where some of these corporate off-takers, large companies that procure renewable energy would want a project. It could be a municipality, it could be another regulated utility. But understanding the commercial interest is definitely a big part of that. Going back to the large project north of Dallas that you mentioned, Tim, that Invenergy is doing, that's over 1,000 megawatt project. And one of the really great things about solar is, the sky's the limit in terms of capacity. I mean, physically, you can just keep expanding these things as long as you have enough land and availability on the grid to inject it. So you're going to keep seeing more situations like this. And with a project like that, after the developer had identified, understood the capacity situation, understood some sort of indication of commercial interest, the next step is to really get out into the field and start gauging interest of landowners. And we used to always say land in terms of priorities and importance for these projects and their success and development. Get land control, start talking to landowners, start talking to community leaders, understand what the local appetite of these projects is, from direct project participants and also from other stakeholders that maybe might not have a direct stake in the project. But really, at that point, getting out of the desktop, getting boots on the ground, talking to folks and seeing if you can actually physically secure the land requirements for what's inherently a land intensive project.
Yes, land, land, land. And, that becomes very labor intensive very quickly, right? You're dealing with many, many landowners potentially with a utility scale project. The project I mentioned here in Champaign County is the total site is 1,600 acres. So there's over a dozen landowners involved in that project. Many of them are non-residents, right? They're living in other parts of the country. So communicating with them is complicated. Um, how do you, kind of break that down in terms of really getting a toehold? Is it you find a large landowner and then you work your way out, or is it a scattershot approach, or it just depends? Different developers take different approaches to that dartboard.
All the above. I think as developers, especially young developers, myself when I started, it's easy to get caught up in the great economics of these projects. You look at the land leases we would offer versus grain farming, which in a lot of cases is kind of a break even business these days, and you just assume everyone's going to welcome you with open arms, and just based on the economics alone. And some people do, certainly, but a lot of people don't. And the way to really communicate these projects effectively, I think, is twofold. One, it's obviously important to make sure everyone understands the impacts, how this is going to change their community. And the great thing is about solar, low visual impact. They're not very tall, not much noise at all. And so that's frankly not a very difficult story to tell on the impact side. But even more importantly is really to communicate the benefits of this project. And the benefits truly are very, very local for a renewables project. I think people a lot of times talk about the great benefits these things have on a global scale for climate change, but don't neglect the local story. And from environmental things like clean air, clean water, healthy soil, the solar panels in terms of a power project, they produce no emissions, and would directly compete with the coal plant down the road that might be reducing the air quality in the area. Clean water. One of the communities I worked in, Tim, before I left Invenergy, was Iowa County, Wisconsin, and I was a developer on a project called Badger Hollow Solar Farm, a 300 megawatt project under construction currently. And right before I left, the county issued a stop drink order from the wells in that area because the aquifer was so contaminated with nutrient runoff from the agricultural activities. And the solar project under construction is that one was about 2,200 acres of developed area, and that land will be taken out of traditional agriculture. Synthetic fertilizers will no longer be used. There won't be manure spreading on that land anymore. It'll be native prairie for the next 30 years. And we have no doubt, in addition to the great improvements on the soil, that'll have a lot of positive impact to the water quality as well. And finally, the last one is communicating the economic benefit outside of just direct landowner payments. Do not neglect to communicate that this is going to be a huge, in a lot of communities, this is going to be instantly the largest taxpayer in the county. And depending on how the tax structure is there, there's a lot of times a great story to tell for the local schools, local services, and that benefits everyone. In some of these smaller communities, you can actually calculate the percentage of their property tax bill that this project could theoretically offset. So just be sure to communicate the benefits. And in my experience, that gets you 3/4 of the way there. And then there's certain things you can do to address specific people that are opposing it. Like you mentioned, Tim, trying to really engage a community leader who is in support of the project to try to help you along the way, and get in touch with some of these folks. But there's also lots of project design things you can do to try to mitigate their feeling of being burdened.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned land use changes. Solar is generally going to be a significant change to the land. We're mostly taking rural land, whether it be ag land, grassland. 40% of the United States is used in some way, shape, or form for feeding livestock, for example. So huge, huge swaths of the country are used for feeding livestock, for growing the crops that feed livestock. Here in Illinois, of course, we have some of the best prime farm ground in the country. And unfortunately, as you also mentioned, grain farming is virtually non-economical. It is completely dependent on government subsidies to be profitable. And so while farmers are tempted and ultimately will sign land leases, and I want to talk about what it is that solar developers are asking of landowners, it is a change. And these communities don't necessarily adapt easily to change because they've been in a particular land use, whether that's corn and beans or some other form of ag or livestock growing, for a long time, for multiple generations, sometimes over 100 years. And so it does take a concerted, gentle, but firm approach, educating people about what is solar, how does it work, is it going to poison the land? That's a question that is often asked because
Mhm.
people don't understand what solar panels are. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Some people even claim that it's going to cause a noise nuisance, that the inverters are going to be too noisy. And that's just not true. I've stood next to central inverters and heard the sirens and barking of dogs and the wind louder than the central inverters. Um, so that's the good news for developers, is that solar is very light on the land. You're converting it from industrial ag, let's say, to a solar farm. Here in Illinois, a lot of the solar developments are going to be planted then in native prairie grasses and forbs. And you're going to have organic farm ground after 25, 35 years
Mhm.
of development as a solar farm. The solar farm is just steel piles, many times I-beams, driven into the ground with glass panels on top of them, and then some wires running through the site, of course. And all of that can just be pulled out, and you're back to good old, wonderful farm ground. So it is very light on the land. But how do you address this change in the land to the community? And are there specialists that can help developers negotiate that relationship building?
Yeah, and you make some really good points. First of all, um, solar farms are agriculture. That's just not my opinion. That's been the opinion of agencies at the state level in states like Wisconsin, for instance. And there's been a lot of innovation in farming. Think of how a farm has changed from the 1800s until today. I mean, all the innovation in equipment, the actual species of crops grown, water management. Farming, we think of this as a romantic traditional activity. There's a lot of innovation in farming. And, in a lot of folks' minds, solar is just another iteration of that innovation. And it's you're farming the sun, whether it's with solar panels or soybeans. So I think, helping people understand that this is still agriculture at the end of the day, is important. And so, you know, uh, helping people visualize things, put it in the context of the height of, a row of corn, the solar panels would compare to that. Try to provide visualizations. There's consultants that can very quickly take a picture at a landowner's property and render what the project would look like from their property, so they can get a sense of kind of how the project would look to help put them at ease. But regarding, professionals out there that can help you, signing, as you're aware, Tim, I mean, you're going out signing over 1,000 acres of land. That takes a lot of time. It's a lot of conversations at kitchen tables. It's a lot of follow-up conversations, a lot of phone calls. And there are folks that specialize in this that can help you along the way. They're called land agents, is one group you can use. And I say group, I mean, they're generally independent contractors. But these are folks that may have been farmers themselves. They have a lot of experience in, concerns that farmers will have about use of their land, and they can help kind of translate, a city slicker developer like myself to, a farm community, and both ways, and educate the developers and also help educate the farmers on, the impacts and the benefits of these projects. So if you can find a great land agent, is worth their weight in gold. Do not waste, or do not waste time scrutinizing them. Be very careful on who you use, because they're representing you as the developer. But they're just very, very helpful in terms of signing that land.
Yeah, we recently had a company called Terrapro Solutions on the solar podcast. Check that out. Kimberly Centera. She's another consultant that works with solar developers on de-risking on the front end, and then she works with them really throughout the life cycle of the project, especially on the real estate side. So, there are layers to, I'm no real estate expert, but there are layers to these real estate issues. One of the issues that has popped up here in Central Illinois is that some of the landowners have mining contracts. This is coal country, and they've signed lease options, and we should talk about what a lease option is, and then how that progresses as the project moves forward. But so, well, yeah, why don't we get into some of those nuts and bolts? You've got landowners, you're using land agents to identify and build relationships, and then you're sitting down, or the agent is sitting down at the kitchen table with these owners, and the goal is to get a lease option agreement. Generally speaking, what is that agreement and how does that work? And then what is the next stage once a project moves to permitting, say?
Yep. I can definitely do that. And before I go on, I do want to just mention one more group that can help with this. Local communications. It doesn't necessarily help directly with signing land, but it does help indirectly with getting the message out there. And there's firms that do this very well in terms of hiring local people, opening a local office, doing local communications. One that we work with is called Good Steward Consulting. They're based out of Albert Lea, Minnesota. And they do a really good job of this. So lots of consultants and contractors that can help you do the project, and keep your visits out to the field, as reasonable as possible. But going back to your original question, Tim, in terms of the nuts and bolts, one of the things farmers really care about is predictability in terms of the seasonal planting cycles. These farming activities require a lot of capital, buying seed, buying equipment, trying to plan in advance for the volatility of the planting and the harvesting season. And so, everyone's leases are different. Every developer's leases are different in how they secure the land. But one of the key things absolutely is being able to provide them assurances that up until they're earning significant revenues on the project, they'll be able to still use the land for what they're currently using it for, grain farming or livestock, for instance. Another key thing that is important to communicate to a lot of these folks is, assuming your project is designed this way, which most of them are, but as you mentioned, Tim, this is a temporary use of the land. and making sure that's very clear in the land agreements and also is communicated very clearly. It's a long-term use, but after the lease is up or after the project's done operating, the actual decommissioning process is pretty light touch. You pull the piles out. In certain cases, you might remove the underground or overhead collection. But this is if it's a lease structure, this is a temporary use of the land, and whoever owns the land at that point, even if it's not that current landowner, is going to have some really awesome soil to use if the world does want more traditional agriculture. Um, I think Tim, it's also interesting you brought up, how much agricultural land we have in this country. If you're in a community developing a project, just calculate the amount of acres of agricultural land in that county or in that state, just to get a sense of how much ag land your project's taken out of production. Because I guarantee it's going to be a lot less than you or anyone else thinks it is. And that can oftentimes help put landowners at ease that, you know, I'm turning my land out of traditional agriculture, but someone else is gonna pick up the slack. And frankly, in certain communities there might not be a need for so much agricultural land. Maybe the other neighbors benefit by less supply being out there. So yeah, I think all those things are really important when discussing with these landowners. And obviously, make sure you effectively communicate the economics because they are so good. Every market's different, lease payments are different, but really making sure you're communicating just how economically beneficial these projects are for the landowner and the community is important.
We only have a few minutes left, and the good news for our audience is that we're going to do another session in January on this topic because it is a deep topic. I'm going to quickly reference those two companies' websites. You mentioned Good Steward Consulting. I had the pleasure of meeting one of the owners of that company, and I'm going to share my screen so people can see that website. What is the name of the principal there? I can't remember her name.
Mariah Lynn.
Yeah, Mariah knows farming. She came from a farming community, I believe in Minnesota. And so she really understands from a farmer's perspective how these folks are thinking about their land and their future and how they see renewables and how developers can effectively build relationships with landowners. Some developers come off as being too aggressive. Some of them will, for example, just shotgun letters to all of the landowners in a particular area, and it can feel like your community is under attack. And so you have to be careful about how you approach these things. And then the other company that I would encourage people to check out is Terrapro Solutions. Here you see a nice graphic of all the services they offer: fatal flaw analysis, site selection and feasibility, site acquisition, title due diligence, title curative, and Alta survey review. So check out my interview with Kimberly Centera at Terrapro Solutions. We could probably spend a whole hour just talking about permitting, Robert, because that is also deep water. You're dealing with landowners, and then you're dealing with authorities having jurisdiction. Some of these AHJs, being counties, for example, have very little experience with renewable energy, or they've had a negative experience because they had wind and they reacted negatively to that. And they're conflating wind and solar. That's a thing that happened here in central Illinois, that residents just tried to put them all in the same bucket. And I have nothing against wind development. I think wind is wonderful and necessary for the energy transition, but I also wouldn't want to live underneath a wind farm. So every source of power has its pros and cons, and solar has its cons as well. It is a change to the land. Absolutely. There is an impact. I don't want to minimize that. I want to help people completely understand what is that impact It is a boon for the local community economically. It is a boon for the landowners. These are communities where the residents are leaving in droves. Our rural communities in the United States are losing population. The next generation doesn't want to be on the land. The economics are very tough. The
Mhm.
cities are more attractive, more interesting places to be. And so really renewables are a lifeline for these communities. We can build bridges to communities, and there are many landowners who are now very pro wind and solar. You mentioned Badger Hollow. I saw one of the Badger Hollow landowners speaking at an event in Madison, Wisconsin, and he was talking about the economics of using corn for ethanol, for example, and how solar for electricity is so much more efficient use of land at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And so, and we have to remember that most modern farm practices are pretty heavily industrialized. You're using a lot of chemicals, and that means a big carbon footprint, and it means a big ecological load on the land that can be relieved and lightened when you convert the land to, especially solar. I mean, the uh, the area impacted by wind turbines is relatively small in terms of the actual physical footprint of the turbine compared to a solar farm. So anyway, um, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our meeting today, and I want to thank you, Robert, for coming on the show, and look forward to getting information out about our January event, where we will really get into some of the nitty gritties of leases, contracts, permitting, and then getting these projects out of the ground. They take multiple years, sometimes 10 years to develop a large solar project. And so you have to be patient. You have to do lots of due diligence. And again, you have to have a credible team of people that know how to collaborate. I want to encourage our listeners and viewers to check out all of our content at cesnrg.com/videos. I'm doing 3 shows a week now. And um, so if you're interested in solar development, whether that's commercial, industrial, or utility scale solar, we have lots of content that is great. And this is that landing page, cesnrg.com/videos. Just hit that subscribe button. That is our YouTube channel. And just this week, we brought you Nick Warner at on energy storage and fire safety, Ryan Simpson at Trina Solar talking about trends in PV modules. We had PVAL on talking about the PV inverter scorecard, and on and on. So please check out our content at cesnrg.com. Subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and give us your comments. We love to hear from our listeners. So I want to thank you, Robert Howard with Greenleaf Advisors, for coming on the show. And I really look forward to part 2 in January. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.